As the title would suggest, in this video I'm going to be investigating fashion watches, a side of horology that, ironically, I have no time for, to see if, among the sea of poorly made, overpriced quartz models with a random fashion label's logo on the dial, are there actually any hidden gems? The definition of what is and is not a fashion watch is not exactly clearly defined, even if it is much derided. So I want to lay out what I mean by a fashion watch as clearly as possible before I start. Essentially, I think that any watch bearing a recognised brand name that isn't associated with horology is fair game to call a fashion watch. It's probably worth talking through a few examples here for clarity. A watch with Hugo Boss or Ferrari on the dial would be a fashion watch. A watch with Braun on the dial would not, because despite not being the first thing you think of when you hear the word Braun, they do have a long history of making watches. I'll also say now I won't be including the start-up brands who essentially try to do the same thing as established brands without the associated clout. So, no Vincero, Daniel Wellington or Filippo Loretti, to name but a few, even if some people would absolutely describe those as fashion watches. For the purposes of this video, and frankly because I don't want to look at them, we'll stick to mainstream brands. And yes, I know Ferrari have the ultra thin, but really we know it was Richard Mille putting in the horological legwork there. Before we try and uncover if there are in fact any good fashion watches, it's worth taking a little more time to talk about why they have such a bad reputation to begin with. Essentially, the accusation levelled at them is that they're something of a shameless cash grab. These are usually cheap to produce watches made from low cost, cheap materials featuring equally cheap quartz movements that are marketed as luxury items because of the associated brand name on the dial. You might question why people would buy something like this beyond the brand name, and to answer that question we need to consider the position of some of the consumer base. A recent study of 2,000 of the British public revealed that 1 in 6 people struggle to read the time unless it's displayed digitally. While that is hardly conclusive evidence, it does indicate that a fair number of people cannot read the time. I don't think it's then a huge leap to suggest that the number of people who will understand watch movements, materials and what represents value for money is likely to be equal to or greater than the number of people who cannot read the time. Essentially, what I'm saying is there are a high number of people who don't fully understand what they're buying when it comes to watches. I need to be clear, I'm not making a judgment on people here, it's happened in my own family. I'll try to explain. My family know I'm interested in horology, and occasionally someone close to me will buy me a fashion watch as a present, not knowing any better. To me, it feels very much akin to a relative buying you a rip-off version of a video game when you were younger. Something that looks and sounds similar, but it just isn't quite right. The fact that I'm even asking the question, and that I've made a video on it, might imply that I think there are, but I wanted to explain the format of the rest of the video. I've picked out a few models based on the definition I gave at the start, and I'm going to take you through them one at a time and talk about why they might be more deserving of your time than the average fashion watch. I'm going to go through them in price order, but unlike my regular list videos, there isn't going to be any kind of cap on spending here. I'm not for a moment saying that these watches are value for money or that everyone is going to like them, just that I think they're better than a regular fashion watch, which, as we've discussed, is not a high bar. You'll have to approach these watches with a loose definition of the word good, is what I'm really saying. It will come as no surprise that I wrote this little section after scripting the rest of the video. This was really hard to make because there are thousands upon thousands of fashion watches, and the truth is most of them really are awful, so please don't expect too high a bar. With all that said, let's get into the video. Now I know, Why would you ever buy this when Casio exists and does the same job for less money? Well, the Adidas Digital 2 range was produced in collaboration with the Timex Group. So that alone should give you a bit more confidence in the watches compared to just a digital watch at face value. You have to remember that for the purposes of this video, the Digital 2 isn't really competing with Casio, just other fashion watches. In that regard, I think it's a pretty strong offering. It has some really nice retro styling to it and is available in some really quite attractive colourways. And while of course you could get an F91W for a lot less, it is quite affordable compared to a lot of fashion watch fare. How much you read into reviews is entirely up to you, but there are a number of glowing ones about this particular model, far more so than you'd find with most fashion watches. I dare say you'd credit a fair amount of that to Timex, not Adidas, but would you have known Timex were involved if I didn't explain that situation? Probably not, based on the lack of logo on the design. I wanted to feature at least one watch on the list that was pure, unadulterated fashion watch and didn't buck the trend in any way like the others I've chosen to feature. This one doesn't even bother to tell you that it has a quartz movement inside, so I definitely think it fits the bar. What it does have, as the name would suggest, is a minimalist design language, which I can tell you, after looking through thousands of fashion watch models, is a blessed relief. A lot of fashion watches are extremely busy in terms of their aesthetics, with jewels, subdials, indices, materials, labels, plastered all over the dial in a way which might make Invicta blush at times. If you're going to get a fashion watch, I think the minimalist versions are far less offensive. The Meta Minimal has some very unoriginal design language to it, but that doesn't mean to say it's an ugly watch either. Allow me to pull back the curtain a little and explain how I actually found this watch. The process was quite simple, but probably something you've never thought to do when watch hunting. I went on a UK jeweller's website, searched men's watches by brand, and then unticked all the brands that actually have anything to do with horology. Then I scrolled down to movement, and instead of browsing the hundreds of quartz options, looked at the tiny automatic selection. From the very limited choices on offer, I then picked out the only thing that actually resembled a watch. While not ugly, this is not exactly original, and while it does have an automatic movement, not a single website online can tell me which movement is used, so I can only assume a very cheap Far Eastern option. Having said that, being an automatic was already enough to elevate it a little above the usual fashion watch offerings, so there is that. There are several variants of this watch, and I have to say I think the ones with the logo brandished wildly all over them are hideous. However, the more understated versions are a far more interesting proposition. Are you paying massively over the odds for the Gucci logo? Absolutely you are, but I guess their justification is that as a proper fashion house, their logo is worth more than your average high street brand. Certainly, value for money is not why I've chosen to feature this model. The reason it's here are the unique aesthetics. When I see this design language, I'm not immediately put in mind of anything else. If you read up on the design inspiration for the grip range, you'll find that it was inspired by 1970s skateboarding culture, and the brushed steel surface of the watch is meant to be reflective of grip tape used to make sure your feet cling to the board. You are getting sapphire crystal in those small windows, and yes, these watches are quartz, but they are at least Swiss Ronda movements. It's still a rip-off, but at least a rip-off with a unique look to it that's already enough to elevate it beyond the standard homage fashion watch fare. Is it good though? I'll leave that call up to you. This entry might be a little contentious considering what I said at the start of the video about a brand like Braun not featuring because they have a long history of making their own watches. Porsche have had watches made for them by IWC since 1974, but it wasn't until 2014 that they started making them for themselves. There are a fair few car brands who slap their logo on a quartz watch in the hopes that people will overpay for them, but Porsche are a completely different animal. The Chronotimer Flyback features their own chronograph caliber, the Work 01-200, which is a COSC certified movement. The watch itself is made entirely from titanium and has unique design language when it comes to the lugs and strap configuration. It is quite bulky, at 42mm in diameter and nearly 15mm thick. There's no lug to lug listed, but I'd wager that that's because the answer is enormous. If I had $7,200 burning a hole in my pocket, this watch would be far too big for me to consider. But it is absolutely levels above what you might expect from everything else you've seen previously. Louis Vuitton started making watches back in 2002, but you'd be forgiven for not knowing that, as their models are extremely limited and extremely expensive. As the price might indicate, this is not your average slap the brand name on a quartz watch and be done with it kind of fashion watch offering. It's a 3-hand dress watch with an in-house LFT 023 micro rotor movement, which, let's be honest and call a spade, it's beautiful and far better than you'd see from a lot of actual horological brands. You're getting a platinum case and a slice of meteorite for the dial. Is it really a fashion watch? Well, that's up for debate. It certainly has a fashion house's name on the dial and logo on the crown. Only you could decide if it's worth what is approaching the deposit for a house to own. But I think it's hard to argue that this is actually a very nice watch. I really wanted to find a fashion watch for this video that I thought was really good value for money in terms of what it offered. I thought that perhaps a quartz chronograph with day-date functionality would be a good way to look, but I really struggled to find anything below the $100 mark, and what I did find had no business being in a video with the word good in the title. I think value is perhaps the biggest issue with fashion watches. With actual horological brands, their logos should act as a sign of quality, speaking to the product that they're offering. If you buy an Omega product, yes, you're paying extra for brand prestige, but there's also reassurance that the product will actually be good quality at the same time. With fashion brands, the issue is that the logo on the dial has nothing to do with how good the product it's been printed on actually is most of the time. If you're willing to pay huge sums of money for models from fashion houses that have actually made their own bespoke chronometer standard timepieces, then the answer to the question of the video is yes. There are some good fashion watches out there. However, even my favourite model from the video, the Adidas Digital 2, doesn't really boast fantastic value for money. As I said earlier, we're going to have to play fast and loose with the definition of good with what is on offer here. You'll find plenty of articles online from people saying that looking down on fashion watches is just horological snobbery. Maybe there is some element of truth to that, but I spent a long time looking for good watches in the trenches for this video, and I've really struggled to come up with much. And even what I have found, most of it I wouldn't actually recommend buying. With all that being said, I'm only one man, and I'm more than capable of being wrong. So if you know of any fashion watches I haven't featured here that you genuinely think are good, please let me know about them in the comments below. I'm always keen to find out about watch models, no matter who makes them. As ever, thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen or found it informative, consider dropping the video a like, and subscribing if you want to see more content like this.